All right, our notes for today are about the Cold War abroad. It's a fairly large set of notes here because it's covering a lot of information. So this chapter of our textbook deals with the ways in which the Cold War spread around the globe. We've so far covered sort of the origins of the Cold War and how it started, right? How the U.S. became Cold War enemies with the Soviets. Well, this chapter deals with, now that the Cold War has started, how does it spread? And what does the U.S. do about it? What does the U.S. try to do in order to keep it from spreading? So the first area we're going to look at has to do with the Cold War in Asia. And we're going to look at two specific countries, China and Korea. So first, let's talk about China and how China fell to communism and why that was a big issue for the United States. During the 1920s and 30s, so prior to World War II, there was a civil war in China. And you had Chinese communists who were trying to take over the country. And they were led by this guy named Mao Zedong. He was opposed by this guy named Chiang Kai-shek. And through the 20s and 30s, these two factions, communists and non-communists, are fighting for control of China. Well, so what? Like, what's that got to do with the United States? Well, the U.S. has, for a long time, had an interest in China. You had American merchants trading goods back and forth with China. You had American missionaries spreading American religious values and religious practices into China, going all the way back into the mid-1800s. So for a good time before this, the United States has been interested in what's going on in China. During World War II, Japan conquered much of China. And so the two sides, the communists and non-communists that are fighting against each other, put aside their differences. They suspended their conflict because they had a common enemy in Japan. However, as soon as World War II ended, they went right back to fighting. That civil war fired up again. By 1949, the communists had won. Mao Zedong and his group had defeated Chiang Kai-shek, and China became communist. And it has been a communist country ever since then. So what does this have to do with the United States in the time period we're studying? Well, now there's a second major communist country that we have to be concerned about. You know, it's no longer just, oh, the Soviet Union is the big country we have to be concerned with. China was a major country, huge army, and very, very powerful. So a lot of people in the United States were very, very angry and upset to see China fall to communism. So how did we respond? The U.S. responds by isolation, cutting off all trade and all diplomatic ties with communist China. We refused to allow China to join the United Nations. And for 30 years, we basically treated communist China like it didn't exist. We refused to recognize it as the legitimate government of China, and we would not trade with them. And that remains the case, as I said, for a good while. It's not going to be until Richard Nixon that we start to resume those ties. All right, Korea, another major Cold War topic. And we respond differently in Korea. In China, our method of trying to contain them was isolation. We'll try to cut them off from the rest of the world. In Korea, we're actually going to use military force to contain communism. Like China, Japan took over Korea in World War II. And Japan ruled Korea until the war was over. At the end of the war, the Soviets moved into the northern part of Korea. The U.S. moved into the south. Korea was split into two different countries. You had the communist North, which is in red on the map, and the non-communist South, in green on the map. So Korea, kind of like Germany, is split up into two separate countries, one communist, one not. In 1950, North Korea invaded the South. The U.S. went to the United Nations and got the United Nations on board with condemning North Korea for doing that and setting up what was called an international police force, which is basically a coalition, a group of countries who committed troops and resources to force North Korea back. But most of the troops and most of the money came from the United States. Okay? It was a UN effort, but a lot of it came from the U.S., and we wanted to get North Korea out of the South and push them back. We ended up actually pushing North Korea almost all the way out of the Korean Peninsula. And once we started getting close to China, China got involved and sent troops to help North Korea. So after 3 years of fighting, the North and the South declared a truce with each other. Everyone went back to their original position, and the boundary has remained the same ever since. Technically, the war is still ongoing. It was a truce. It wasn't a treaty, which raises some concerns about, well, what if that war were to fire up again? That still could happen today. You've still got a communist North and a non-communist South that are not very good friends with each other. So in Korea, the method we see is the U.S. actually using military force to resist the spread of communism. Now let's talk about other areas of the world. As the Cold War spread, the U.S. used several different methods. Propaganda was one. A group called the United States Information Agency beamed radio broadcasts that were pro-democracy, pro-capitalism into communist countries. So you see in this picture here, it gives you that idea of radio stations in Western Europe sending radio messages into these communist countries, telling them about the benefits of capitalism, the benefits of democracy. Obviously, the Soviets weren't wild about that. They tried to block those broadcasts, and they banned Western radio stations. But it was very difficult to block a radio signal. So the U.S. fought communism that way to try to keep it from spreading, using propaganda. Another method was by giving assistance, giving foreign aid. And the U.S., as we already know, gave money and military assistance to friendly countries. That was the Truman Doctrine, right? We'll help out any country that is trying to fight communism. But it wasn't always necessarily a positive for the United States. In some countries, in particular Nicaragua and Haiti, we actually gave assistance to people who were basically dictators. They weren't terribly good leaders. They were pretty harsh to their people, but the United States supported them because they were anti-communist. Covert action is a third method that we use to resist the spread of communism. Covert action simply means a secret operation that tries to influence other countries. So think CIA and sort of spying and other sort of covert secret actions. We already know that both countries, the U.S. and the USSR, use spies to gather information on each other. And the CIA would sometimes work inside of countries very secretly to work to overthrow unfriendly governments. And we did this in several countries. Your book mentions Iran, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic. And even some of those times, we were working to overthrow democratically elected leaders because we felt they were kind of communist, or that that they were friendly towards communism. So think about that. The United States worked to overthrow sometimes democratically elected leaders in order to fight communism. Our last topic is the arms race, which your book covers. And what was the arms race? Well, it was this idea that both sides were very, very focused on developing more advanced weapons than the other side, having a stronger military than the other side. So anytime, one side would do something, the other side would try to match it or beat it. So we know that the United States was the first to develop atomic weapons. But by 1949, the Soviets had matched. They had tested their first atomic bomb. So next, both sides worked to develop a hydrogen bomb, which is even more powerful. And then both sides worked to develop missiles that could deliver nuclear warheads to targets that were farther and farther and farther away. And then they worked to develop nuclear-powered submarines that could launch nuclear missiles from the sea. Right? So every time that one side came up with a weapon, the other side would try to match it or outdo it. It was a race to try to get the biggest, strongest, most powerful, deadliest weapons in order to be stronger than the other side. And this continued, this arms race continued until the end of the Cold War, right? In the late 70s, early 80s, there were some efforts to slow it down. So what you see here is a picture of the US President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s signing a treaty with the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev as a way to try to slow down that arms race. But it really continues throughout the entire Cold War. Make sure you print these notes. Go back and rewatch anything that you're uncomfortable with, not quite clear on. And if you have questions, make sure you note them and bring them to class next period.